Okay, all right. I guess we're gonna get started. Sorry, I wasn't sure exactly how this was going to pan out. So, if you are here to join the Apply Smarter webinar from VIN Foundation to learn a little bit more about how we counsel pre-veterinary students on how to approach veterinary school and applying to veterinary school, then you are in the right place. We've got a lot of experience with helping pre-vets, veterinary students, and veterinarians, particularly when it comes to navigating their student loans, right? So veterinary school is quite expensive, and it can be very expensive or less expensive depending on the school that you choose. And the debt associated with that can be extremely stressful to pay back once you're done. And in some cases, it can also change your career plans. So we want to make sure that everybody has a pretty good idea of how to approach applying to veterinary school so there's no surprises, and talk about how you can minimize some of the student debt stress that is associated with paying for veterinary education. So we're going to dive in, and I've got some questions for you to set the stage, and hopefully all of you have a phone or something handy that you'll be able to join the Mentimeter, which is a polling system that we'll use when people are kind of scattered out and about in this webinar format, but I'll show you what the code is for that in just a second. This is what we're going to cover over the next 45 minutes or so. I want you to know how much veterinary school is going to cost, essentially how much debt you can expect to take on. We can't talk about debt without also talking about income, right? And I know that, there's this common stereotype that nobody goes into veterinary medicine for the money. Well, you need to at least know about how much a veterinarian earns, right? Because at some point you're going to have bills and you're going to have to pay those bills. Your debt is going to be one of those bills, right? So you're going to have some kind of knowledge of what veterinarians earn, at least based on the data that we have available from recent graduating veterinarians. I want you to know the difference between what I call discounted and non-discounted seats. A lot of people call those in-state, out-of-state, resident, non-resident. There's some ones that fall in between. So I tend to use something that's a little bit more broad to capture a lot of the variations that we see among the different veterinary schools, right? So I wish it was just as simple as in-state and out-of-state, but as you'll learn over the next 45 minutes or so, it's a lot more complicated than that. You could use the application stats to your advantage to increase your odds of getting in, and that also aligns with paying less, more than more, right? And that's essentially the concept that VIN Foundation calls apply smarter, right? So using those application statistics to know about, who's getting into which particular school, so you can increase the odds of getting into veterinary school that first time that you apply. And a lot of times that's going to align with the least costly option as well. All right, so now we're going to start with the polling question. So if you have a phone handy, or if you want to just open up another window on your computer, you can either zap your phone on that QR code, or if you go to menti.com, MENTI.com, and enter the code 97081679, then you will see a page that will ask you the next question, right? So you should see a page that shows you when you apply to veterinary school, where will you call home, right? And that's what I want you guys to tell me now. All right, I see some people jumping in there. Right, I see some people that are off the map. That's cool. If you want to chime in the Zoom chat and tell us where you're attending from, that would be great. Very cool. Thank you. Thank you. I see a lot of California. That's pretty cool. We're actually going to use UC Davis, the veterinary school, as an example of how you can dig through these application statistics. I see some other states as well, so that's great. All right. Zoom in. All right. So next question is going to be, what is your application status? Right. So when are you applying, essentially? Well, hopefully you guys are seeing that question. I'm getting some weird feedback here on my Mentimeter. Try to get to that next slide. All right, so you guys should see what is your vet school application status.
Tony, are you able to share the results as they come in where we can see them, or?
Let me see. Trying to get that to work, and my computer is not responding. All right, let me see if I can get this to show. You may have to abandon the Menti. Doesn't seem to want to play nicely for me today. Here is here is the results from the where are you? Man, sorry, my computer is not behaving well today. So it looks like most everybody in California. I see a fellow Colorado. That's where I'm sitting. Washington, North Carolina, some of the ocean here, maybe on the East Coast, Hawaii. That's great, right? So the next question in here is, what is your school application status? A couple of cycles away. Great. So this is helpful, really helpful information for you to start adding to your database while you're thinking about applying. So it looks like it's the majority of you are in the, what is your vet school? You're a couple of cycles away at least, applying this next cycle. It looks like nobody's waiting to hear back, right? So the current cycle is open and closes in about a month, right? And that will be who determines who's going to go to vet school starting next fall. All right, so all of you look like you're a decent ways away. So what schools are you going to be applying to? So let's see kind of a sample of what you're thinking in terms of what schools you think are on your short list. Okay, cool. I like the combination there. Western Oregon, UC Davis, Cornell. That is a good smattering there. Aussie UC Davis, that's great. St. George, Texas A&M, Arizona, Purdue, another kind of wide variety there. Illinois, Arizona, RBC, Glasgow, right? World Traveler. Right. So we've got a good smattering of schools here. I mean, and hopefully just, you know, I see a lot when I see the names of these schools. I mean, Western is going to be a lot more expensive than Oregon, right? Oregon and UC Davis are going to fall in a similar cost profile. Cornell, if you're not a New York resident, is going to be similar to Western, right? Arizona, if you don't live in Arizona, is going to be a pretty expensive school. RBC Glasgow, attending veterinary school overseas is very expensive. And student loans work a little bit differently. UPenn is a private school, right? So just from the feedback that you're providing here, right, we can start to build some cost profiles just based on the names alone, right? Based on what kind of school they are, you know, whether they're a public school, private school, whether they have in-state rates, out-of-state rates, or some kind of combination between. How much do you think it's going to cost you to go to veterinary school? So a lot of you are a few cycles away or a couple cycles out from applying. So maybe you haven't gotten into the nitty-gritty yet to know exactly how much it's going to cost you to become a veterinarian, but take your best guess. Great, thanks for being honest. Not really sure that's why you're here, right? So numerically, it's for most of us, we're not just sitting around with enough cash in our pocket to just pay for our tuition and living expenses for the duration of the 4 years of veterinary school, right? So we see kind of a bell curve developing here. So yeah, I mean, really the answer is any and all of the above, right? So it can be less than $100,000. The average is somewhere between the 200 and 300 for those that take on debt, right? But there's definitely people who graduate from veterinary school with more than $500,000 student debt too, right? So the cost range can be very wide ranging, right? And your goal, ideally, by attending sessions like this, will help you to reduce your cost profile if you use some of the tips and tricks that we're going to talk about today. All right, again, we can't talk about that, and this is going to be the last question, and I'm going to ask you guys. So I won't torture anymore. But how much do you think a new veterinarian earns? Right. So after you graduate from school, how much can you expect to earn as a new graduate veterinarian in the United States? Great, cool. Thank you for answering those. So again, we see somewhat of a bell curve developing here, right? And the answer, once again, is all of the above, right? So it really depends on what you're going to do after veterinary school, right? People that go on to do internships and residencies are going to be in that $30,000 to $50,000 range, right? If you go on to do maybe equine practice that first year, you might fall in the $50,000 to $70,000 range, right? Mixed animal practice, $70,000 to $90,000 range. Companion animal closer to the 90 to 110. But there are emergency practitioners and other types of practice where folks can graduate and earn well into the six figures after veterinary school. Right. So it really depends on what you plan to do with your veterinary degree after you graduate. That's going to determine how much you're going to be able to earn. All right, we're going to come back to the presentation. So hopefully that's just going to kind of set the stage. It gives me an idea of what you guys are thinking and how much you expect, your expectations kind of coming into this. And now I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I do this, right? So I'm a veterinarian. A lot of the members of the team here that are supporting behind the scenes, if you have questions or curiosities in the Zoom chat here, are veterinarians. But I'm a married two-vet household. I'm also married to a veterinarian. We both went to Colorado State University for our veterinary education. I went as a resident of Colorado. My wife went as a non-resident. She went on to specialize in small animal internal medicine, and I went more the GP route. But combined, we have student debt in excess of $400,000, which sounds like a lot. It is a lot. It's a big number. We're able to manage that using a combination of the federal income-driven repayment plans that are available. But it's certainly easier to manage less than it is to manage more, right? Now, I certainly didn't anticipate having to manage $400,000 of debt when I went into veterinary school, right? And this represents the combination of mine and my wife's student debt balance, right? So it really was more of a function of marrying a veterinarian who also had student debt, right? So combined, we have that $400,000 of student debt. If you have student loans now, right, you want to work with that information. Right, and you can work with that information by going to studentaid.gov, reviewing the details behind the student loans that you currently have, so you can use that as a starting point to make sure you're accounting for the loans that you already have, in addition to the ones that you might be taking when you enter veterinary school. If you don't have any student loans yet, that's okay. Right, we've got some tools over on the VIN Foundation Student Debt Center where you can start from scratch, essentially. So you can use the in-school loan estimator in the VIN Foundation Student Debt Center to help you project what your cost will be depending on what school that you're targeting, right? So depending on the school that you choose is going to have a cost profile associated with it. There's going to be interest associated with the student loans that you take on when you go to veterinary school, right? We want to make sure that you have a pretty accurate picture of how much you anticipate borrowing and ultimately graduating with, to see if that changes how you might approach applying to veterinary school. Right, so this is the VIN Foundation Student Debt Center. Right, I don't have time to dive into all of it. I just want you guys to be familiar with it. It's free. Anybody and everybody does use this. Right, it's designed specifically for veterinarians and veterinary students. Right, but anybody with graduate school loans can use this. Right, so if you have loans already, then you would use what we call your student aid data file to upload in here, right, to document that amount. And then you can send that information over to the in-school loan estimator. We've got some tutorials down here that can help you locate that student aid data file. Right, and then if you don't have student loans, then you can just start with the in-school loan estimator. Right, so the in-school loan estimator will take you directly to the tool that will help you navigate, just as a quick example here, right? Let's say you were going to go to Colorado State and you were going to start your veterinary education 2 years from now, roughly in early August, and you finish in 2028, and I'm going to borrow 4 years. Let's say you're going to go at the non-resident rate, right? So you're going to borrow roughly $85,000 a year, right? At about 6.5%. That's what the interest rates are on student loans now. We can generate those details, and you can see that if you did borrow that amount for 4 years, plus the interest that would accrue, you would finish your education at Colorado State with about $386,000 of student debt. Right. So this, and if that number scares you, right, that's where you're in a position now to say, well, maybe I don't want to go to Colorado State as a non-resident, right? Maybe I would rather apply as a resident somewhere. Maybe even you can establish residency at Colorado State like I did right before you apply, and that would dramatically decrease your cost of borrowing, right? And that's really what the Apply Smarter, the tools are there to help you piece that information together so it's not such a surprise once you get in and done with veterinary school in terms of how much debt you finish with, right? Because once you start veterinary school, there's not a lot you're going to be able to do to control your cost, right? The tuition is going to be what it's going to be. Your living expenses are going to be within a certain range, right? And unless you can get some really significant scholarships to defer a lot of the cost, your debt balance is largely going to be determined by the school you choose, right? And this is what we see from the AVMA data, right? So there's a lot of schools, a lot of you listed some of these schools as schools that you plan to apply to. You'll also notice here that these are only the US schools, right? But you'll see a pattern, right? Or you should see a pattern here, right? So you can see the debt is higher, the median debt, right? So the median is, 50% of the people are below this number, 50% of the people are above this number. And you can see that different schools have different ranges of reported debt for their veterinary school graduates. The income, however, the green line, doesn't change all that much, right? There's really not a significant difference in the income that you can stand to earn no matter what school you choose, right? And I think that's one of those myths that float around out there among the pre-veterinary community, that if you can get into the top ranked US News and World Report veterinary school, that you'll earn more money than if you go to the bottom ranked one. And that's just not true, right? You stand to earn pretty much the same amount, regardless of the veterinary school that you go to and complete your education in, right? So, but you'll see that the debt number can be significantly different, right? Those folks that graduate from Midwestern, which is another school in Arizona, or Tuskegee or Western, right, which is in Southern California, private school, they're going to graduate with higher amounts of debt because it costs more, right, than if you were to graduate from, say, Texas A&M or UC Davis, right? Because those students generally don't, and the way that school is structured, it's generally more difficult to graduate from that school with a higher amount of student debt. This is another graph that I like to show. It over time, right? So over this 20-year period, it shows which schools have actually done a really good job of minimizing the increases in the debt from their graduates, right? So some of this makes a lot of sense to me. Like UC Davis, they have hardly raised tuition at all over the last 20 years, which is amazing, right? And that's largely has to do with some state factors that a lot of the other states may not have been able to mimic, right? But they have hardly increased their tuition, or the debt of their graduates has hardly changed over a 20-year period. Whereas the average school, it's changed or increased at about 5.5% per year, right? In some schools more so than others. So that's another thing that you may want to look at, right? It doesn't just stop when you get into veterinary school, right? You can see your tuition go up each year that you're in veterinary school, right? From the time I started till the time I finished Colorado State, my tuition went up by close to 35%, right? During school, right? Those are things that are beyond your control in many cases. Right, so ask those schools, hey, how have you been increasing your tuition over the years? Do you anticipate tuition increasing next year and the year after? And make them put a number on it, right? Because that helps you to better estimate your costs when it comes to projecting your total cost of obtaining your veterinary education. And as we kind of talked about, right, you're not going to earn any more because of the school that you choose. Right, the data just doesn't show us that, and we call that a lack of the Harvard effect. Right, so there's no Harvard effect in veterinary medicine. Right, if you go to Harvard Law School, you can expect to have either more opportunities or more high paying opportunities just by virtue of the fact that you're a Harvard Law graduate. Right, we just don't see that in veterinary medicine. Right, so you don't have to pay more for your veterinary education if you don't have to. So just to give you a little bit more information on what various areas within veterinary medicine are earning, right? So this is the data from the most recent data that at least I have access to for the 2021 graduating class, right? It breaks it out among various practice types, right? So we can see, right, if you advanced training, that really incorporates anything like an internship or residency. The average reported starting salary is around $40,000. If you head into private practice, it's quite a bit higher, right? And if we average it across all of the private practice types, it's about $98,000. You can see that companion animal exclusive are commanding the highest dollar amounts, right? So this is small animal practice, mostly in urban areas, right? So you've got mixed animal is a little bit behind that, right? So closer to 85,000. Food animal exclusive, closer to 85,000. Equine is always kind of a weird outlier, particularly in that first year after veterinary school, where the reported incomes are generally lower, right? But we also, the number that report incomes are also generally low too. So it's kind of hard to put a lot of weight into that, right? But those are the numbers, right? Those are the numbers that are reported to us from the new graduates in terms of what they're earning after veterinary school, right? So measure that up against, some people are borrowing more than $370,000 for their veterinary education. Some people are graduating and reporting $88,000, right? Obviously, the lower your debt to income ratio, right? So you take your student debt, you divide it by your income, you get a debt to income ratio, right? We call that a key performance indicator, right? That's going to largely help to indicate the financial health of a new graduate veterinarian, right? The higher that debt to income ratio, the harder it is to manage your student debt, right? And just because you borrow more, right? If you were to borrow $370,000 for your education and get paid $100,000 a year, right? The practice owner is not going to pay you more just because you paid more for your education, right? Your income is going to be determined based on your practice type and the geographical region that you're practicing in, right? They're really not going to care how much you paid for your education, right? They're going to pay you what you can generate in income and what they can afford to pay you based on that practice type in that area where their practice is, right? So your goal is to keep your debt to income ratio as low as possible, right? Because that's going to help to increase that return on the investment, which the investment is in you, right? It's in your career. Becoming a veterinarian is an investment in you, right? And in order to help you increase the return on that investment, you want to pay as little as you have to for your veterinary education. And that's where the seat types come in, right? So you'll see here again, the AVMA, school choice is the most significant factor for explaining variations in debt, but school choice does not have a significant impact on starting salaries, right? So that's where it's incumbent on you to really know how much does it cost for this seat that I'm applying to, right? Is that seat a resident seat, an out-of-state seat, right? Is there some way for you to get a discounted rate for that particular seat that you're applying to? Right? Because if you're paying full price, there's a good chance you're going to end up closer to the 370 rather than closer to the 87. right? And the higher your student debt balance is, the higher your debt to income ratio is after graduation, the much more difficult it is to manage your finances as a veterinarian after graduation. Okay, so everything starts with the Association of Veterinary Medical Colleges, right? So when you get ready to apply to veterinary school, you're going to visit the Veterinary Medical College Application Service, or VINCAS, right? So this is run by the AAVMC. So this is the application portal to nearly all accredited veterinary colleges. I think Texas A&M is one of the lone standouts. There might be a few other foreign schools that are not part of that VINCAS system, but the overwhelming majority of the schools you're going to apply through VINCAS. And most pre-vets, I mean, most of the I would say the predominant questions that always come up are questions about prereqs and letters of recommendations and what do my GRE scores need to be and is my GPA high enough? But I really want you guys to think beyond that, right? These to me are kind of like check the box kind of stuff, right? Yes, you're going to need to get prerequisites. You're going to need to complete prerequisites in order to be able to be considered as an applicant, a valid applicant. You're going to need letters of recommendation. Right, so you're going to have to develop relationships with veterinarians and folks that can write you some glowing letters of recommendations. Your GRE scores are really, I mean, there's nothing really I can do to help you with your GRE scores, right? They're going to be what they're going to be, right? But we can help you to stay out of the high end of the student debt realm if you're thoughtful about the schools you choose to apply to, and that starts now. Right, that starts while you're in this process of researching those schools and creating that short list, right? Making sure that you're not, or hopefully not, going to include schools that are going to potentially put you in that really high cost range, right? When again, it's really not going to help you earn any more or less as a veterinarian. Right, so how do you increase your odds of acceptance? Look at the accepted stats for the schools that are on your short list. Right, start with the state schools, right? State or public schools generally admit more in-state residents, right? A lot of their governing documents require them to admit a certain amount of residents from the particular state for that school, right? And there's usually fewer resident applicants for those in-state seats, which means your odds of getting one of those seats are higher. Right, so look at these admission stats, right? And here's a couple of examples. So we're going to use UC Davis, LSU. They tend to just kind of stand out. And again, because you guys are, this particular session is organized by California, right? We want to make sure that you know what the UC Davis stats are. So that almost every veterinary school is going to have a page that looks like this, right? They're going to have application statistics for that school. So the most recent one we can look at here is for the class that entered last fall at UC Davis. And you're going to see some interesting things that jump out here, right? So you're going to see that 550 California residents applied, 142 were offered admission, right? That's pretty good, right? 433 non-residents applied, 28 were offered admission, right? So right off the bat there, you can see that I've got a much better chance of getting an offer of admission as a California resident to UC Davis than I do if I don't live in California and I'm applying to UC Davis, right? The stats just kind of hit you in the face with that, right? And you're going to see that dynamic play out quite frequently across a lot of the different schools, particularly the state schools, right? So LSU, another great example of how this works, right? So class of 2025, so there's a class that started last fall. 194 Louisiana applicants, 67 were enrolled. Right, so if I open up my calculator here, right, 67 divided by 194, right, nearly 35% of those folks who applied from Louisiana got in. Right, so when I can't tell you how many times people have said over and over and over again, veterinary school is hard to get into. Yeah, if you're applying as a non-resident, it's extremely hard to get into, right? 38 divided by 955. Right, 4%. Right, 4% of non-residents got into LSU. Right, when people say it's hard to get into veterinary school, that's the number they're quoting. right? It's not nearly as hard for you to get in to a state school if you're a resident of that state when you're applying, right? And the numbers are staggeringly different. And so if you want to improve your odds of getting in, apply to a state school as a resident of that state. So your first test, right? Where do you want to go and why? Will you need to use student loans? How much does it cost? Don't forget about the interest, right? In that brief intro I gave you to the in-school loan estimator, there was nearly $40,000 to $50,000 of interest that accrued during that 4-year period as a non-resident at Colorado State, right? The more you borrow, the more interest will accrue, right? So not only are you paying a higher amount as a non-resident, but you're also going to accrue a higher amount of interest. Does student debt stress you out? Right, this is going to affect everybody differently, right? So I mean, after graduation, we help a lot of people navigate their student loan repayment options, and some of the most stressed out folks that we help have some of the lowest student debt totals, right? And then some of the people that are walking around with $300, $400, $5,000 of student debt don't seem like they have a care in the world, right? And they stress me out, right? So, but the more debt that you have, the more careful you have to be with it, because it can get out of control really quickly. Right, so it's always easier to manage less than it is to manage more. Living expenses play a big role in that, right? Are you going to have to pay, or will you be able to pay for those out of pocket? It's really tough to have a job while you're in veterinary school. Some people can do it. Maybe you can defray some of those living expenses, but maybe not all of them, right? So you have to get creative when it comes to thinking about how you're going to cover all of these expenses, even beyond just the tuition and fees. Do you have family assistance, right? Will your family be able to help you with any of these costs for veterinary school tuition and fees or living expenses? And scholarships and grants, right? How much is available? Every school is a little bit different, right? So you want to know, a great question to ask the admissions office is how many of your students receive financial aid other than student loans, right? So how many of them receive scholarships, grants, and what's the dollar value of that per year? Right, so that can help give you an idea of how much you might stand to get from scholarships or grants from that particular university. Is there a discounted tuition rate for you? The answer is always yes. Always, right? Doesn't matter where you live. There's always a school that has an option for you to obtain something other than the non-resident rate. Right, now, some of those might require you to get a little bit more creative than others, right? But there is always an opportunity for you to get a discounted tuition rate, right? And that's what we're going to talk about next here. I think this graph, this is from an older AVMA economic report, but it does a great job of kind of going through, the different cost profiles, right? So public, these are state schools, right? So the residents of those state schools report the lowest amount of debt. The non-residents kind of next. Private, those who attend private schools report higher amounts of debt. Those that attend island schools, or the foreign AVMA schools, they tend to report the highest amounts of student debt, right? So again, thinking back to that no Harvard effect, right? Those who have the lowest debt levels attended public schools as residents, right? That's pretty consistent. So what does that mean when it comes to applying? Start with your in-state school option, right? Or any school that allows you to pay that in-state rate. Right, so we've got a couple of consortiums, if you will, right? Because not every state in the U.S. has a veterinary school, right? So you can, in certain cases, like out west, we have the Western Interstate Commission on Higher Education. So because for example, New Mexico doesn't have a veterinary school. Residents of New Mexico can apply to schools like Colorado State or Washington State and receive the in-state tuition rate through this Western Interstate Commission on Higher Education. There's a similar one that exists in the South. The Southern Regional Education Board, I believe, is what that stands for, right? And it groups together some southern states that many of them don't have veterinary schools, right? But they will have arrangements with a state that does, right? So those can help residents of states that don't have a veterinary school obtain a veterinary education by paying a resident rate. There's a lot more of these 2+2 programs, right? So residents of Alaska can obtain, start their veterinary education in Alaska, and then they transfer to Colorado State to finish their last 2 years. Nebraska has a 2+2 with Iowa State, Utah with Washington State, South Dakota with Minnesota. All right, so look for these opportunities depending on where you live to see if there's a special arrangement for the state that you live in with a nearby state that has a veterinary school. If you need a backup option, there's a handful of states that allow you to switch your residency classification after you start, right? And here's the list, right? So Missouri, NC State, Ohio State, UC Davis, Washington State. Even if you don't live in one of these states, after the first year, you can establish residency and then pay the in-state rate for the following 3 years. Right? So if you want to apply to more than one school that's beyond your state school option, then focus on these. Texas A&M is an interesting one. They don't take very many non-residents at all, which is one of the reasons why their graduates report very low amounts of student debt. And for the handful of non-residents that they do allow, as long as you maintain a B average while you're there, they cover the difference between your resident and non-resident tuition. Right, so it's very difficult to pay a non-resident rate at Texas A&M, but it's also very difficult to get into Texas A&M as a non-resident, right? Because that's not a secret. So, and it's generally not a secret for any of these other schools either. The drawback of applying to one of these schools that has this ability for you to change this residency classification is that they tend to get a lot of applicants, right? So you have to be a pretty good out-of-state applicant to be considered for one of those limited seats. And as I showed you earlier, right, the numbers don't favor out-of-state applicants to state schools, right? Unless you're a very, very strong applicant. But that's another way to keep those costs down while you're attending veterinary school. Once you get in, federal student loans work a little bit different than they do during undergrad, right? You're able to borrow up to what the school calls the cost of attendance. You'll have access to direct unsubsidized and direct grad plus loans. Those are pretty much the majority of the loan types that people use to pay for their education. And it's pretty much limitless, right? Whatever the school says the cost is going to be, you can obtain loans in that amount. Right? Once you get to graduate school, which veterinary school is graduate school, you're considered to be independent from your parents. Right, so the EFC, the expected family contribution, is almost always zero, unless you are married or you have a very lucrative job that shows on your tax return that would, decrease the amount of student loans that you're able to receive. But, the overwhelming majority of students attending veterinary school have an expected family contribution of zero, which means they're able to borrow up to the cost of attendance, whatever the school says it is, in federal student loans. Right, that's both good and bad. It's good because you don't have to worry where's the money going to come from, right? So literally anybody that can get into veterinary school can pay for it, right? But the numbers can be staggering, right? So that's the downside of having a system set up this way. It's right. There's always enough student loans for you to pay whatever the school says, right? But you're going to be responsible for managing that amount once you finish veterinary school. There are a handful of opportunities for what's called subsidized loans. So subsidized loans are loans that don't accrue interest while you're in school, right? But they're very, very limited and usually in very small amounts. Right? So health profession student loans, loans for disadvantaged students, depends on the school, depends on your family's financial circumstances. But these are, if you can get these, great, right? Because this will generally reduce the amounts that you take up here in these loan types that generally accrue a lot of interest. Federal student loans, some people look at this and are like, well, I'm just not going to use federal student loans. Unfortunately, I would not recommend that either, right? Because federal student loans are going to be your most flexible, right? The whole reason why somebody like my wife and I can have $400,000 of student debt and still have a financial plan that involves something other than paying our student loans is because they're federal student loans and because they have very flexible repayment options. Right? So you want to keep the majority, if you have to use student loans, you want to keep the majority of that loan in the federal system because it's going to give you the most flexible repayment terms. We do have a lot of resources on VIN Foundation that covers borrowing, right? So borrow better, we call it. Repay wiser is another initiative that we have through VIN Foundation, where we help our veterinary colleagues navigate their student loans and repayment options. And then I'm super excited. Pretty soon, we're going to have a book that chronicles all this, right? So we piece together and we do these kinds of events pretty frequently. And finally, we pulled them all into a book for veterinary students that they can use to help navigate student loans while they're in school and navigate repayment as they're getting started after graduation. So look for that. If you want to sign up through vetschoolbound.org, the contact page, we'll let you know the details of that when it's going to be available, probably later this fall. When it comes to family support, better to be applied upfront than after school. So classic scenario, right? Family is super excited that you got into veterinary school, and after you graduate, they want to give you a gift of money to help you pay with your student loans, right? It would be better financially if they gave you that gift upfront, maybe in the first year, to reduce the amount of student loans that you have to borrow, right? Because that's going to have the most favorable financial consequences for you and that family member. And it's going to reduce the total amount that you have to pay back after school by the greatest amount, right? So better if that family support is provided upfront than after school, right? Sometimes you can't control that, but if you're having some of these conversations with your family member now, let them know that, hey, you know, if you're sitting on some money that you want to give me after veterinary school, better to pay that tuition in that first year, where it will reduce the amount of interest that accrues for the duration of the 4 years in school, right? Than to give you that money after the fact, and then a good chunk of that payment goes mostly towards interest. Once again, steer clear of those private or family loans, right? Every year we do tend to see a handful of graduates who are responsible for paying, $200,000, $300,000 of student loans back to their family. And that's a really awkward position to be in, right? And, sometimes your family doesn't really understand how veterinarians are paid, or if you want to go on and do an internship or residency and your income is going to be a little bit less for a little bit longer, right? That may cause some awkward family holiday meetings if you owe them, 6 figures of debt for, 10, 20 years after school. Okay, let's see, X factors. So things that you can also do to help boost those chances of getting in. Meet with your target veterinary school admissions office, right? So they sit down and they look at thousands of applicants every year. They know the ones that stand out versus the ones that don't, right? Ask them what you can or should be doing to create an application that will help to stand out, right? But it also means you need to do your homework, right? Just don't show up at that admissions office and say, hey, I love Colorado State, right? Know what the prerequisites are. Right? Come in with a list of informed questions, right? Show them the progress that you've made so far. Have a transcript from your undergrad education handy, right? These are the classes I've already taken. Am I missing anything, right? Here are my grades. Are any of these grades maybe lower than they should be, right? Is there something that they recommend in terms of boosting maybe one bad grade or something, right? So come in with that information prepared, right? Just periodically check in with them. Right? Inquire about those scholarship grant opportunities. See if there are other unique opportunities to increase your odds of acceptance. A lot of schools will have these dual degree programs, right? So I actually at Colorado State, I attended or was accepted under the combined MBA DVM program, right? And they get very few applicants to that combined program because there are very few people that have kind of a business background before they attend veterinary school. Right, so it really boosted my chances of getting in because I wasn't necessarily the best student in undergrad, right? But I did have some robust life experience that helped to lend itself well to the combined MBA DVM program, right? And they only admitted 5 students under that program, right? And there were probably only 10 or 15 applicants, right? So you can see that there are other creative ways to help get you into veterinary school if your prior experiences align well with some of these combined programs. When it comes to scholarships, right, I can show you the macro view, right? So AAVMC collects this data every year, and we can see that maybe about half of veterinary students receive about $6,000 per year of grant or scholarship, right? So not a lot. right? Now, there are some that receive some really big dollar amounts, but those are few and far between, right? On average, the numbers are pretty small, right? So you should be prepared that you're going to probably have to use student loans if you don't have some outside funding source to pay for a lot of this education. If interviews terrify you, right, then come on over to VIN Foundation. We had some veterinary students write some blog posts about how to navigate panel and multiple mini interviews, right, for those schools that have those, right? So that's extremely valuable information. Again, some of the things I try to steer clear of, these GPA, GRE, prereqs, right? Those are literally get on the website of the school that you're targeting and look and see what they publish, right? And do you meet those? And if you have questions about them, that's a great reason to reach out to that admissions office and develop that relationship with them. I show this every year. They don't update this anymore, but it's still available, right? And this link is in this presentation, and everybody always wants it, right? But this is a great overview of some of the legwork or some of the things that you should be looking at when it comes to the various schools, the various veterinary schools. Right. So I wish AVMC kept to update this, but they don't. And it's only going to be available as long as they keep it on their website. And right now you can still find it. Right. But it lists all of the schools, their location, right? These resident versus non-resident tuition rates are out of date now. They're a couple of years old. Right. But it still kind of gives you an idea in the ballpark of what they are. One of the really valuable things here are, how many seats do they have available per resident or non-resident, whether or not they have a contract with something like Witchy or something else, right? So down here in Mississippi State, you can see that they had or have a contract with South Carolina and West Virginia, right? So that's really helpful information to know. The other one that's been changing rapidly recently is the GRE, right? When I applied to veterinary school, which is now eons ago, almost every school required the GRE, right? Now, nearly no school requires the GRE. Right. So make sure that you're kind of following along with those, see if, the handful of schools that you're thinking about applying to still requires the GRE, right? If one of them does, you're going to have to take it. If none of them do, then congratulations, you won't have to take it. Right. But that's one of the things I think is really worth trying to figure out and know now is whether or not the school actually requires the GRE, and know that a lot of the schools are kind of moving away from that recently. Okay, so just some things that we've learned, some other studies that are out there. You'll find a lot of great data from Dr. Lisa Greenhill, who works with the AAVMC, and she studies pre-veterinary school applicants. And some of the data from her findings that she publishes usually annually at the AVMA Economic Conference that's in the fall is, shows some interesting themes, right? It shows that most pre-vets don't really put a high value on the total cost of the school they're applying to. They're more worried about the actual cost of applying, right? And I'm going to tell you why that's kind of ridiculous in just a minute, right? But try not to fall into that trap, right? On average, we see that most people apply to 5 veterinary schools, right? And that's cool, right? You can apply to your state school and apply to one of those other schools that allows you to switch your residency status after that first year, right? That would give you more than 5 if you really need to apply to 5 schools. So make sure cost of attendance is a factor for you, right? Because if you wait to think about cost of attendance until after you apply, then the cost of attendance won't matter to you, right? If you get a letter of acceptance from a school that is very expensive, and it's one of the only letters of acceptance that you get, almost no pre-vet is going to say, well, I can't do that, right? You're going to go. Right? And you're going to pay more than you probably have to, right? And you just have to be prepared that you're going to have to be really creative and careful when it comes to managing the student debt associated with that, right? But if you really want to avoid that scenario, don't apply to one of those schools that has a very high cost profile. Right? So here, the cost of applying is a driver, right? So on average, a pre-vet applicant tell us that they spend about $2,500 applying to veterinary school. And this stresses you out. And rightfully so, right? I mean, most people aren't walking around with $2,500 to spare. However, depending on the school you choose, there can be differences that are in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? So make sure you make the cost of attendance at least as big a stress factor as the cost of applying. Right? Because this is pittance compared to the $200,000 to $300,000 cost difference between a school like Texas A&M and Midwestern, right? So this, this is nothing compared to the cost difference between the tuition and fees at various school types. Once you've already applied, right, worrying about the costs, it's too late, right? I mean, again, it's the very, very, very rare pre-vet who's going to have the maturity to say, I'm going to decline this offer of admission at this higher cost school and reapply next year at the lower cost school, right? It's just not going to happen. And then pre-vets tell us that they're willing to pay $1,200 towards their student debt, which suggests a significant disconnect when it comes to what that $1,200 is going to do when it comes to actually paying for their student loans, right? So you either have to borrow less than $112,000 for that to make a meaningful impact, or you're going to have to earn more than $160,000 a year, which generally is not happening in veterinary medicine, right? So think about these things sooner rather than later, right? The best time to consider your educational costs is before you submit your application, right? And luckily, most of you told me that you haven't submitted an application yet, right? So this is the perfect time for you to consider this cost of attendance idea. Student debt is extremely stressful, right? We've got Merck wellness studies from veterinary medicine that tell us so, right? Every year or every other year when they repeat that study, student debt is one of the top 2 stressors reported from practicing veterinarians, right? It's always easier to manage less than it is to manage more, right? And that means that you have to act now to try to leave out some of those higher cost schools as part of your application strategy. And normally, it's a win-win, right? I mean, again, for those of you that are California residents and you're planning to apply to UC Davis, not only is that probably your best cost of getting in, it's also probably your least costly option, right? So that's a win-win, right? If you don't necessarily live in the state that has the school that is your first choice, consider moving there and establishing residency, right? That's what I did when I decided I wanted to go to Colorado State. I moved from Illinois to Colorado and made sure I established residency so I can meet the residency requirements because I knew I had a better chance of getting in, right? So you can do that too. It's a little extreme, right? But if there's a school that you really want to attend for any reason, right, then consider establishing residency in that state so you increase your odds of getting in. Explore those other creative options like those combined programs, PhD DVMs, Masters of Public Health combined with DVMs, MBA DVMs. More and more of those things are popping up. They generally have fewer qualified applicants. Here's a list of resources. If you're interested too, we've got on VIN Foundation, we've got a pre-vet area. It's a message board area. We kind of borrow it from VIN, the Veterinary Information Network, but we're allowing pre-vets to join the conversation in the Apply Smarter message boards to ask questions about what does it mean to be a veterinarian? How do I become an exotic veterinarian? Or what's the best way for me to apply to veterinary school given my circumstances? And VIN is an online community of 90,000 or more veterinary students and veterinarians, and they're all there to provide some guidance and assistance as part of those message boards. Right, so you can join. It's free. Right, and then it'll give you a username and password that you can use to get into the Apply Smarter message board area. You can see the conversations that have already happened from pre-vets, or you can start your own, based on your experience and where you'd like to see yourself in veterinary medicine. You can even post anonymously in there if you'd prefer, which is helpful in getting the answers that you need. What questions you have in the, now 1 minute I have left before I'm sure you guys will have to run to your next sessions. There it is.
We do have a question here in the chat about where are the veterinary schools in the WRGP savings finder on the WICHE website, or is that in a different tab?
I'm not familiar with the WRGP savings finder. I'm not really sure what that is.
Yeah, I was trying to see if I could look in and determine what where that was, but it's the Western Regional Graduate Program. It's part of that, but I couldn't find an answer there either. I wasn't sure if you did.
Yeah, I'm not really sure. I'm not familiar with that. So I would focus more on the WICHE, the Western State Commission on Higher Education, and then look specifically for the veterinary programs that participate in that particular program. I also see a question here about, can you show us California? And I'm assuming that means on the in-school loan estimator. So yeah, we can certainly show you California while we've got, for those of you that are still here, let's see if that will play nicely. So if I go over to the My Student Loans tab and open up the in-school loan estimator. And when you say California, I'm presuming you mean UC Davis, right? Because we've also got, Western, which is also in California. And UC Davis is an interesting case because unfortunately, they don't necessarily publish this information, but this is information that you will find out if you meet with their admissions office and you ask them questions about scholarship and grant opportunities. But if you were to attend UC Davis, let's kind of push it out a couple of years from now and say you start in August and you have 4 years left to borrow, and we'll assume you're going to apply as a resident, right? The total cost of attendance can look quite high. However, every year, tuition paying residents of California end up getting something close to $8,000 per year in grants to help decrease their total that they need to borrow, which is extremely helpful, right? So, I mean, you get the equivalent of almost 1 year's worth of tuition across these grants. Now, this isn't guaranteed every year, but it's been received every year as long as I've known. Right now, the state of California can discontinue this at any point in time, but right now it's still in place, which is great, right? So I think those things are extremely helpful. This will decrease your cost estimate, right? So we're looking at something closer to $255,000, right? According to that, if you borrowed everything that was offered to you, right? Now, if you have a budget during school and you've got some roommates and you can reduce your cost of living, right? You might be able to knock off another, $10,000 or so off of these estimates per year as well, right? Or if you've got health insurance that are covered through your parents, right? There are some schools that require health insurance and you can opt out of that cost if you have some other way of paying for that and things like that. So, there are other ways that you can help to decrease some of the amounts that you borrow, provided your budget and circumstances allow.
Jennifer, thank you.
I see another question there. I heard that there are some federal jobs that offer some loan forgiveness through USDA or FDA, but do you happen to have any information on government jobs that offer loan forgiveness? Yeah, that's a really complicated question, right? So there are certain jobs that you can take with government positions that will actually provide you some tuition assistance, right? So they will directly help you pay for your tuition. But then there are also jobs that you can do after school that might help you earn public service loan forgiveness, right? If you do that for 10 years, then any remaining student loans you would have would be forgiven tax-free, right? And there are still other jobs that you take after school that will pay towards your student loans, as kind of a signing bonus or for, finishing some amount of work for specific government agencies, right? So it really depends on the type of program that you're talking about and the type of program that meets your career goals and interests. But yeah, those are great opportunities to look for, like the Army, right? For example, the Army is an excellent opportunity. Like the Army will pay or give you something like $30,000 or $40,000 a year if while you're in school, right? If you sign on to being an Army vet for some number of years after school, right? Now that's a little bit different than something like public service loan forgiveness, which has you working for maybe say the USDA, right? You're making payments on your student loans, but you're working towards public service loan forgiveness over maybe a 10-year period of time. right? So those are very, very different programs.
Yeah, and I believe the most recent iteration of that veterinary core agreement is that you have to serve a 1-year internship and then 1 year per each year that you got that scholarship. So it's typically a 4-year commitment.
Very cool. Those are great questions, though. Those are great questions. Ask your admissions office those same kinds of questions, right? What opportunities do you have to help me reduce the amount of student loans that I need to take on? And hopefully they're going to provide you a list of opportunities that exist at that school to help you apply for or reduce some of those student loans that you need to take. Any other questions, comments? Great. I'm sure you guys probably have either another session to get to. My apologies for the technical issues we had along the way, but thanks for your patience and sticking in there. And if there's anything that we can do to help along the way, please feel free to reach out. We've got an email, apply_smarter@vinfoundation.org. Feel free to reach out with any questions that you may have. Thanks, everyone.